Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola, along with her guests, are going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, this is Nicola Brook from Broudie, Canter Solicitors. I'm the solicitor with day-to-day responsibility for managing our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of COVID bereaved families for justice. I'm here today with Lobby Akinnola, who is a member of COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK, having very sadly lost his father to COVID in April 2020. Also joining us is Enda McGarrity, who is solicitor from PA Duffy, and he acts on behalf of Northern Ireland COVID bereaved. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Nicola.
So we're here to discuss week 4 of the Module 5 hearings, which was the conclusion of Module 5, which was looking into procurement. Quite a lot of witnesses. The focus really for week 4 was on evidence from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland before moving on to the closing submissions. So the first witness we heard from was Jean Freeman, who was responsible ultimately for ensuring that the health workforce in Scotland had access to appropriate PPE during the pandemic. And she was at pains to say that Scotland did not have any kind of fast-track system for suppliers. Everyone who came to them with an offer of assisting with PPE all went through the exact same triage process, the exact same due diligence process. And she said that we did not have a VIP lane and we did not need one. And this is the real counterpoint to the evidence that we heard from the likes of Matt Hancock, who repeatedly justified the VIP lane by asserting that it was necessary because of the pressures of the pandemic. However, what he fails to miss is that all other countries were facing the exact same challenge, but no other country resorted to having a VIP lane. So what do you make of that, Lobby?
I don't think the evidence or that statement made by Mr. Hancock makes a lot of sense, especially when we look at the people who got access to the VIP lane. It seems that their credentials for producing PPE were somewhat suspect. So I think it flies in the face of logic, from my opinion, that every other country in the world was able to have a process where they triaged requests for PPE. Everyone was operating under the same pressures, and yet they didn't see the need for a VIP lane. And I think when you look at it, it doesn't really make sense to have, especially at a time of crisis, people tendering for contracts without investigating and doing the due diligence to make sure that that company or those people are able to produce the PPE that people so desperately need.
Yeah, totally agree. Now, Jean Freeman went on to talk about lessons learned and said that for the next pandemic, they really need to recognise the importance, and she used this phrase, of wrapping our arms around all of the health and social care from the very outset. Despite saying that, she said she did not agree with a statement from Dr. McGaskill that social care sector was considered secondary. She said that they all worked very hard and worked as quickly as they could to get PPE out to care homes and to the care sector. And I think this just speaks to the disconnect between those in charge and those on the ground. And what for a politician may seem very, very quick, for those on the ground, that could feel like a lifetime when you have that fear of going into a shift, not knowing whether you're going to have PPE. The fact that those who were working hard to resolve those issues, it comes as, I would imagine, quite small comfort when you are literally risking your own life just by going to work. Now, Lobby, I know your dad worked in the care sector, so this must really hit home for you.
It does. my dad passed away early in the pandemic, but he saw the need for protection during COVID, during the height of COVID, and he was using, his winter gloves and scarves as makeshift PPE when he was going to work. So whilst for the politicians, it may not have seemed that they moved slowly or they believed they acted with appropriate urgency, I think the consequences tell a different story. And we see so many people lost their lives because they weren't adequately protected. It highlights the need to learn lessons and to make sure that the plan isn't just to address the needs of institutions like the NHS, who obviously are vital and do need to be supported. But as is frequently the case, healthcare and social care are intertwined. And when one of the system fails, the other one becomes overburdened. So I think it's imperative that we learn that lesson and make sure that providing equipment and PPE for those working in the different sectors, we take a holistic approach so that, to borrow the phrase, we wrap those protective arms around everybody.
Again, Lobby, totally agree. The final thing I wanted to mention about Jean Freeman was she said that suppliers of PPE in England had been instructed to prioritise the English NHS settings over Scotland, even where suppliers had contracts with Scotland. And she said this was raised in a meeting with Matt Hancock. She said she did not expect Matt Hancock to say, yes, you're right, that's shocking, I'll make sure it doesn't happen. What she was doing was that she was laying down a marker to say, we're aware of this, and now I expect you to do something about it, without having to actually admit that this is going on. And I just think this is absolutely remarkable. Now, this came out as a result of our questioning. But the thought that one government would lean on suppliers and tell them to prioritise that government over another country who we're supposed to be working with is absolutely shocking. Well, it is to me anyway, but Enda, you might tell me that this is a tale as old as time.
Absolutely, and one of the common themes that comes up during the inquiry, no matter what the module is this unbalanced relationship between central government and the devolved authorities. In this case, it's a bit more significant in that they've actively worked against them. But I actually thought Jean Freeman was excellent on this area generally, because she set out quite clearly, but probably more clearly than the Northern Ireland witnesses, how that disconnect actually works in practice, and how actually when it comes to procurement, having that local democratic accountability is actually better than how the UK government approached their own procurement policies. We drew on this in closing submissions, obviously, where Brenda Campbell had set out the distinction between Jean Freeman's position and that of the likes of Gove, Hancock, et al., where the notion of democratic accountability in Scotland meant that Scottish decision makers acted as a defence to things like the VIP lane, whereas Gove and others advanced democratic accountability as a reason to have something like a VIP lane. And basically that there's no issue with civil servants being leaned on heavily to as long as the end result is the same in Gove's view. Obviously, we favoured the local democratic accountability model that Freeman advanced, and basically the opposite of that almost inevitably results in the cronyism and corruption that we've seen at UK government level. So yeah, there's definitely one where there's an unbalanced view between central government and the devolved authorities, but something that we've seen in other modules as well.
Thanks, Enda. The next witness we heard from was Caroline Lamb, who was the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland. And there was lots that came out from her, but I just want to focus on two issues. One was the ventilator challenge. And she explained that the Scotland approach was to try to procure ventilators that were the same make that they were already using in Scotland. And this was because they didn't want clinicians who were already under extreme pressure to need to be trained on and figure out how to use brand new ventilators that they weren't familiar with. And when you contrast that with the approach taken in England, now in England, not only did they ignore the importance of familiarity with complex equipment like ventilators, but they then tried to get brand new inventors to create completely new ventilators from scratch, which no one would have familiarity with. And we saw that with Dyson in particular, but just the ventilator challenge as a whole. What do you think of those two different approaches, Lobby?
I mean, again, I think it flies in the face of common sense. You know, if I was in a frantic rush, for example, to drive a loved one to hospital, I wouldn't be trying to hop in a brand new car to, you know, figuring out where the clutch point is and you know, where everything is in the car to make sure at the time of crisis I could get to where I need to go. It makes sense to me that you consider the people on the ground and what their needs are, what their requirements are, the people who are going to be caring for our sick ones during the height of the pandemic, and using that. I just don't think it's an opportunity to be driving an innovation when you're already on the back foot. We need to be making sure that our priority is the well-being of those coming into the hospitals, not what I suspect seem to be like some vain attempt at economic growth, you know. I think, again, the results speak for themselves, and it's clear that by taking steps to make sure that people were familiar with the equipment they'd be using, you just ensure that processes can be as smooth and efficient as possible. Yeah, again, like I said, it just seems like common sense to me.
I think that's a really excellent analogy, Lobby, and I think that really just kind of simplifies how common sense should have applied, but sadly didn't in England to some extent. The other aspect of Caroline Lamb's evidence that I wanted to talk about was having a UK approach. And she said that having a single pandemic and distribution plan didn't serve us well. And that's the reason why they used the Scottish system to procure their own PPE, because they knew that the single UK approach wouldn't give them what they needed. And she was asked about what would work in the future. And she said that potentially it could work in the future, but that what would be needed would be a collaboration of equal partners, as she put it. And that would have to bring all the devolved territories to the table. Now, Enda, this is something we hear time and again from witnesses called in relation to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I wanted to know from you, is it depressing to hear it over and over again, or is it a good thing that it's being exposed? But more importantly, are the right people listening, and is there confidence that it would change?
Yeah, look, I think it needs to be exposed as much as possible, because only then do you get an understanding of actually how these things work behind the scenes. The solution to a lot of these problems, whether it be around procurement or modeling or stockpiling, seems to be to push forward a UK-wide approach in the future and have effectively one plan that fits everyone's needs. I think from what we've heard from Caroline Lamb and others, that doesn't work unless you have that equal partnership and decision making. So I suppose the question then leads on to, is that going to culturally change within central government, where devolved governments come to the table, are treated as equals and get the exact same, I suppose, bang for their buck in terms of procurement? Or is it the case that the local knowledge and the local procurement actually works better? And I think in this case, it's probably the latter. I think there's arguments for that level of local procurement, and Scotland and the other devolved governments have come out much better in this module because they had what is obviously a common sense approach of triaging procurement offers and not having a VIP lane. But there's other reasons why in a Northern Ireland perspective to have the local flexibility, and obviously there's the shared border with the Republic of Ireland and some of the sharing of PPE with the Republic of Ireland during the pandemic, which we'll maybe come on to. So I'm not convinced there's that pigeonholing everything as having a single UK-wide plan is the right approach. I don't know whether the inquiry will go for that in their recommendations, but I think the devolved position is there needs to be flexibility built in to guard against that power imbalance that there is at the moment with central government.
Thanks, Enda. Gordon Beattie was the next witness, and he's the Director of National Procurements within NHS National Services Scotland. And he talked about how they didn't foresee the problems with the supply chain. He said that there was a replenishment order that was due to come into Scotland, and that was supposed to contain 643,000 items, but France cancelled the order. He said, I don't think we could have envisaged that happening. It's never happened before. But ultimately, that led to the failure of the strategy. In January and February, I didn't have concerns about the ability to replenish the stockpile because it wasn't until European countries started shutting their borders that it became evident there was something really different happening to anything we'd experienced before. So what I'd like to ask both of you is whether you think that's understandable or whether the people in charge should have anticipated that there would be problems with borders and supply chains. Because it was January when we had the first case in England, so we knew by that stage that this was no longer a problem just for China. But equally, given our reliance on China for supplies of pretty much everything, you would start to think that we would have been looking at alternatives for supplies of everything far earlier than we did. What do you think, Lobby?
I couldn't agree more, Nicola. I think there's two elements at play here. One is, preparedness and having a contingency plan for when things go wrong. And I think the second is like you what I think you're getting at is the awareness of the situation and responding accordingly. We saw China having to lock down as a nation, and like you said, China is generally supplies a lot of things for different countries in the world, and seeing that country was locking down, there should have been questions about, okay, that we have potential risk to our supply. What happens if that threat means we can no longer access that resource? And you would hope that would then spur on that thinking for any further steps in your response to COVID. So, whilst you can't anticipate every single shock in a time of crisis, I do think it's imperative that those who are in charge are considering what happens when things do go wrong. And the plan can't just stand on one crucial point of failure. Otherwise, it's destined to collapse. I think especially in a time when, COVID, at the height of COVID, had an international crisis, I think it's really, really important that you think to yourself, what happens if and when other nations shut down? It's an international pandemic. It's very likely that we will not be able to have as much freedom of movement and of goods as we do in normal times.
Enda, any thoughts?
Totally agree with Lobby. I mean, it has to be worst case scenario planning. You can't just hope for the best. And I think a fairly obvious recommendation for the inquiry at the end of all of this will be the need to stockpile and to plan for different scenarios and to not just hope that you can react and get lucky with your procurement. Some of the Scottish witnesses spoke about that, the fact that they've taken their preparedness and procurement ideas and melded them to the point where prior to the pandemic, they're like everyone else, they were planning for a flu pandemic that never came. And now that stockpile that exists for PPE needs to be a little bit more flexible to account for other things. So I think coming out of Module 5, that and the need to procure from a more diverse range of sources will be some of the more obvious recommendations that I think the chair will have to consider.
Okay, so moving on to Tuesday of week 4, we heard from Chris Young, who was a former co-director of finance within the Department of Health and Social Care. And the issue of the VIP lane and potential conflicts of interest was put to him. So the following quotes was read to him. The relationship between a referrer and a financial backer of the supplier had no effect on my decision to approve contracts which had been through the high priority lane. So Chris Young said, I absolutely agree with that approach. The high priority lane and referrers were not a specific matter that any of the accounting officers concerned themselves with. It didn't matter to me personally where a deal had been referred from or to. What mattered to me is the appropriate assurances that came within the first 7 stages had been undertaken and the deal was being recommended on the basis of it being a sound deal. He also went on to say that the level of profits that the supplier was going to make had no effect. He said it was clear that huge profits would be made and that was unavoidable. Now, the issue for me is that when we're in a situation of having to undertake emergency procurement, potential suppliers know that we, as in the buyer, we the taxpayer, we're in a weakened position in our ability to negotiate on price. And so potential suppliers can take advantage of that vulnerability. So as Professor Sanchez-Grales said, this makes it even more important that those who are making procurement decisions are alive to that risk of price gouging and corruption. And so there should be more scrutiny of offers, not less. And that in turn has an impact on the publication of notices of offers. What did you think of his evidence, Lobby?
I think one thing that became a consistent narrative throughout the pandemic was the idea that we were all in this together and the idea of what we, the duty we had to each other. For me, there is a duty of care, especially during this time of crisis. And I think, throwing your hands up and kind of just being like, oh, I just did my job, I tick the boxes and, everything's okay. It's not up to me, it doesn't matter, what profits are made or what deals have been agreed and who's related to who or who's connected to who. I did my job is, whilst it might be, yes, technically correct, I think fails in upholding that duty of care and recognizing that, our success is dependent on literally everybody doing their part. I think a big reason we saw such disastrous consequences from COVID is because there are many people, especially those who were in charge, who didn't do their part. So I find it disappointing to kind of just for someone to throw their hands up and say, this isn't my fault and it's not my problem. I would hope that seeing what was happening in the world, seeing what was happening in the UK, and being in that position, the accountants would want to do what was best for the British public and recognize that actually this is a very precarious time. And so, yes, extra duty, extra scrutiny is required to make sure that not just in financial terms that people are getting the best deal, but making sure that the British public aren't being taken advantage of.
Just picking up on what you said there, Lobby, about people saying, oh, well, I've done my bit, I've done what I needed to do. The evidence of Jonathan Irvine that in that case must have driven you crazy. So he was the director of procurement service in NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership. And he talked about, oh, we had reports of people not being able to find a particular product, but then they were able to evidence that they had delivered that item just the day before to the joint equipment stores. Now, he very magnanimously said that he had no reason to dispute the lived experience of people in care homes. And he said this: I think the more important issue here is to understand what the responsibilities of my organisation are and where they started and where they ended. The fact that he thinks that's more important is quite remarkable. He then went on to say, the national position: in our warehouses, we did not run out of stock on the shelf. We continued to supply day in and day out. What happened to the product after it was delivered and how it was managed and distributed onwards is the responsibility of other organisations. And that just really encapsulates what you've just been talking about. I did my bit. What happens after I did my bit is nothing to do with me. Showing very little empathy for the care workers who were going into work, risking their lives, and doing so because someone didn't know where the PPE was. Lobby?
Yeah, I think infuriating is euphemistic way of putting it. I think it's just a ridiculous attitude to take. I can't understand it. It's something I can't relate to, because I understand, roles have their remit and there's the work that you have to do, but I would hope that, in a time of crisis, or just seeing someone who needs help, that you'd be willing to extend your time and effort to just verify that, okay, where did the shipment go to? What's the last, who did I speak to? Where do I think it is? Just trying to assist. And instead of this, hand washing exercise of none of this is my fault, actually living up to what I understand to be the intent of this inquiry and having a collaborative approach to finding out what went wrong and what we can do better. And I think if we'd had that approach earlier on during the pandemic, maybe more people would have survived.
Enda?
Yeah, agree with that. And speaking generally, the witnesses that came to give evidence who understood that the purpose was to ultimately get PPE to the end user, even if that wasn't specifically their job in the chain, I think those are the witnesses who actually get the reality of the situation for the people at the end stage. And those are the witnesses that are most helpful to the chair, in my opinion. Adopting any kind of a two-tier system whereby someone is able to tick boxes on their end and then not have sight of any other important information. Obviously, you're not going to get a full picture at that point, and that lends itself, and it's almost inevitable that kind of two-tier system is going to result in the types of cronyism and corruption that we've seen.
This theme was picked up by Richard Davis, senior Welsh Government representative, and he just said that my measure of success is the fact that we never ran out of vital critical equipment. And it just brings us back to, what is your measure? Is it by what you have on the shelf in the storage unit, or is it by whether the people who need it had it? Simple as that. Which is your measure of success? And it seems that everyone in government, regardless of which government, is picking the storage unit, whereas everyone who is actually working on the front line is picking whether they had it, which makes complete sense to me. Lobby?
I couldn't agree more. I think, looking at the storage unit as a measure of success just feels like people trying to manipulate data to paint as rosy a picture for themselves as they can. I don't think it makes any sense to do that, because that's not the objective. The objective of PPE isn't to be on a shelf. So using that as a metric of success is a waste of everyone's time. The reason we have PPE is to protect people. So whether that PPE was used to protect people can be the only measure of success. And that's what we're hearing from, like you said, those key workers who were on the front lines, who were risking their lives because they couldn't access that PPE. You would hope that these people would have some empathy, because it's not much good to a starving man to know that there's McDonald's in the other side of the world. It doesn't help. That's not information that solves anything. So I would hope that going forward, people would recognize that their role isn't to stock shelves. Their role is to be part of this system that protects and saves lives.
Thanks, Lobby. Enda, did you want to comment on that at all?
Only to endorse what Lobby has just said. I think that analogy of the starving man and a McDonald's the other side of the world is pretty appropriate here. Yeah, ultimately, if we can't get PPE to the people who need it most, the most vulnerable people, then it's a waste of time having stockpiles somewhere and being able to point to them at an inquiry to say we had everything we needed. The important thing is, did it get to where it needed to go? And sadly, there's many cases where it didn't.
Thanks, Enda. Moving on to Karen Bailey, Chief Executive of Business Services Organisations, Procurement and Logistics Service. I think we shorten that to BSO PALS, and she's in the Northern Ireland team. Now, she explained quite a bit about the IT system, what existed up to the pandemic, and how they quickly moved to put something in place that would enable them to know what equipment they had where, and they seem to have done that quite effectively. But then she came on to talk about how they dealt with offers of PPE. And she explained that they got about 2,000 offers from different companies. And having gone through the triage process, they got that down to around about 45 really useful leads. She explained that there was no equivalent high priority or VIP lane in Northern Ireland. She said all offers went through the same triage process. And she said it was quite a rigorous process that was applied equally to everyone. She said offers were dealt with on a sequential basis, so as they came in, unless it was for an offer of FFP3s, which would then be prioritised because they were obviously so desperately needed, and they were dealt with via a separate stream. Now, all of that seemed to make pretty good sense to me, Enda.
Yeah, I think so. And I think BSO PALS were one of the relative success stories. It was far from plain sailing, but it did appear at that stage to make sense to have a dedicated team within the responsibility of the Department for Health to procure those items. A couple of interesting points in general to pick up from her evidence. Spoke about very large volume of unsuitable face masks in particular, which were procured. They were deemed unusable by the trusts and withdrawn from service. So again, one of the less favourable stories coming out of the pandemic for BSO. But on the flip side, we were able to see, I think, through Karen Bailey's evidence of quite fast learning. And I think we were shown slides and contemporaneous documents from April and March 2020, where it was clear that they were on a very steep learning curve. But it seemed for the most part that they stepped up to the challenge and did learn very quickly. The theme of not being awfully helped out by central government or NHS England was brought up again with Karen Bailey's evidence. She said that there was a lack of confidence in the reliability of central government to assist the devolved administrations with PPE. The direct quote was, the mutual aid just wasn't able to be confirmed, or we couldn't rely on it. It really was a lack of confidence that we were depending on that. We wouldn't be in a strong position locally had we relied upon that. So again, to go back to something I said earlier, the overwhelming evidence from those with responsibility for procurement in the devolved nations was that local flexibility really helped.
Thanks, Enda. The next witness we heard from was Chris Matthews, Deputy Secretary of Resource and Corporate Management Group, Department of Health Northern Ireland. Some of these titles, I don't know how they remember their own jobs. So he explained that they commissioned a rapid review on the 15th of April, and it was commissioned to get a strategic sense, he said, of what was happening in the system and what things needed to be done to get better control over PPE. And he said quite candidly, even though there were sufficient supplies of PPE, some of the PPE was in the wrong bits of the system and then had to be moved to other areas. And he said he thought it was a distribution/logistics problem rather than a supply problem. So again, we come back to this issue of it being on the in the storage unit on the shelf rather than being where it needed to be. But I think the way he termed it wasn't quite as defensive and trying to make it out as though it was all fine. He was explaining that there was a problem, but the problem was at a different points in the system. Does it make a difference to you, Lobby, the way it's phrased?
I think for me, 100% it does. I think there's a difference between recognizing the facts of a situation and trying to, push blame elsewhere. Like I said before, this process, this inquiry is meant to be a collaborative process and coming together to learn what went wrong and how we can try and make sure it doesn't happen again. So it is important to recognize that, yes, there was a stock of PPE in shelves. The question is, how did we get it to where it needed to be? But empathizing and, stating your case with recognition of those who were affected by that failure, I think is vital, and the very least that people giving evidence in the inquiry can do.
Enda, what did you make of his evidence?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with the key point being this conversation around supply v distribution. It is always good, particularly for a Department for Health witness, to get a level of self-reflection there where they realised there were issues. Chris Matthews spoke about the diffuse nature of the health trusts in Northern Ireland. Again, the inquiry has heard a lot about this. The fact that there are 5 different trusts based on geographical location, they each have different leadership, and there's no doubt that the lack of cogency with those different trusts would have led to difficulties in distributing to end users. I think perhaps less self-reflection was seen with the closing submissions, which we'll come on to, but which are relevant to this piece of evidence, because when we talked about the supply to end users in care homes, for example, private care homes who are relying on guidance which is published from the department in relation to PPE, in the closing submissions, there was a position put forward that had private care homes needed the help, they would know where to look. And actually, I think if you had someone from a private care home, whether it be a manager or a resident or a family member, speak to the inquiry about that, there would be a very different picture presented. So a mixed bag from the department between Chris Matthews' relative acceptance that there's issues, and then one day later, roll back from that position slightly in the department's closing.
Thanks, Enda. And then the final witness from Northern Ireland was Conor Murphy, former Minister of Finance in Northern Ireland. Now, I think he was supposed to have been called during Module 2C, but wasn't able to be called due to health issues. He talked about how on the 12th of May 2020, there was a joint letter from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to Steve Barclay in the Treasury in England, basically expressing collective concerns in regard to the limited supply of PPE being delivered, seeking assurance, but essentially expressing a concern that the further away from the centre of Westminster you are, the less your needs are heard or provided for. And he said towards the end of his evidence that his general sense of dealing with Whitehall was of getting an audience but not having any impact in terms of decision making. What did you make of his evidence, Enda?
Yeah, again, continuing on that theme of the feeling that they were being humoured at central government level rather than actively listened to or being a partner in decision making. So while Conor Murphy's political affiliation would lead him generally to criticise central government, I actually think what we've seen was a fairly measured assessment of how it actually works in practice, which is backed up by other witnesses from the other devolved nations as well. So I thought he explained that quite well. As to the rest of his evidence, he was able to point to some success, I think justifiably, particularly in relation to securing some major contracts, one with a company called CR Pharmaceuticals, which he said had actually raised eyebrows in Whitehall because little Northern Ireland, with its very limited funding capacity, was able to secure a major deal ahead of other nations. That was largely thanks, I think, to the role played by Tim Losty in the Northern Ireland Bureau in Beijing, which there was an element of right place, right time to have someone from Northern Ireland in that role and able to make those contacts with companies on the ground in China. But nonetheless, it was important to point out some of the relative success. There was failures as well. The likes of the failed bids for joint procurement with the Republic of Ireland was brought up in questioning. And I think Murphy accepted that it made sense to plan ahead of time, if we're planning for another pandemic, for Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to speak to each other and have joint plans in place for PPE in future. So that was again a fairly obvious learning for the future. And one of the other things he had that was put to him was that Northern Ireland had paid more for equivalent PPE than other devolved nations. And again, the answer was really that at the time they were taking whatever they were able to get their hands on, and for future there are measures that can be put in place to better assess value, but at that time it was about actually obtaining the PPE. So I think Murphy came away all right, probably much better than he would have done had he appeared in Module 2C, because obviously 2C focused on more of the political issues, and in particular his and other party members' attendance at a notorious funeral in Belfast in 2020, which caused a lot of political upheaval. So that would have been a much more difficult set of questions for him to answer than what he faced in Module 5.
Thanks, Enda. Turning now to Major General Philip Prosser, who obviously is from the Ministry of Defence and was deployed into NHS England to help out with not so much the procurement of PPE, but the logistics of PPE and making sure it got around the UK. His evidence was quite interesting, but I want to focus on a very small bit. He said, "I can't hide from the fact that there were demand and supply chain challenges. The way that the supply chain had been established meant that we didn't have visibility of frontline stock. What we needed to do was get data in as quickly as possible." And then he said, "We never used the term rationing. Instead, they used the phrase, open speech marks, centralised distribution to meet demand on a short-term basis, close speech marks." Now, that to me sounds like a difference without distinction. But to be fair to him, he did explain what the distinction was. He said, "Rationing would imply that we've got stuff and we're holding it back. We very rarely held stuff back. It was in some of the early days in April, May that we were very much hand to mouth." Now that just seems to fly in the face of all the "we never ran out." Because if you have to ration, or if you have to hold stuff back, or if you are distributing to meet demand on a short-term basis, as he would prefer it, that implies that if you do what is needed, you will run out. And so it's almost like you're keeping stuff there just so that you can say, we never ran out. The shelf was never empty. What do you think, Lobby?
Again, I think it comes back to what that measure of success is and what people's priorities were. I think, yeah, it's exactly your point, Nicola, that if you're rationing, it's because you're concerned that you will run out. And if you're having to keep stuff back, you can't then pat yourself on the back to say, well, the shelf isn't empty, because there are still people who, you know, are going without what they need. I do find sometimes listening into the inquiry that there's a lot of semantics being used to maybe misdirect from what the issues are. Again, I think not everyone, but many people maybe view this as an opportunity to pass the buck. But yeah, it just baffles me to say that, you know, we had to be careful with how we distributed it, so we didn't run out. But then, well done to us, we didn't run out. I think, again, the metric has to be, did people get what they needed? And we can see clearly they didn't.
So the final witness we heard from was on Thursday morning, and this was David Williams. And he is the former Director General and second Permanent Secretary to the Department of Health and Social Care. And what he said was that by the time any deals got through to him, they had been through a quite rigorous process of evaluation, quality assurance, technical assurance, financial assurance. So by the time it got to him, essentially there'd been nothing there that would prompt him to say no. And if there had been, it wouldn't have got to him. So he can't think of any deals that he rejected. Although there were occasions where he's asked for further information or clarification. Now, the issue here is, and we mentioned this in our closing submissions, is that we've heard about this 8-stage process, and we've heard from witnesses at the start of that process, and we've heard from witnesses who were at the end of that process. And we've not heard anyone who was in the middle. And that's important because the witnesses who were at the start were saying, well, I wouldn't have analysed that because that was for people later on down the chain. I was just doing the bare rudimentary examination. And then you've got the people at the end saying, well, I wouldn't have examined that because that would have happened earlier in the process. Otherwise, it wouldn't have got to me. So there's this glaring omission of people who were in the middle and who were doing that proper analysis. And when you think of how many contracts failed, the fact that we've not heard from anyone to say, well, this is why I authorised that, this is what I read that I now know doesn't stand up to scrutiny, but this is why I was persuaded. And that to me just seems like a really glaring omission in the inquiry. Lobby, what do you think?
I couldn't agree more. I think, you know, the inquiry is set out to try and find the answers, and you can't answer a question you don't ask, you know? So it seems, again, I keep saying it, but to defy common sense that we haven't heard from anyone in the middle of this pipeline, especially when all the other witnesses are pointing towards that middle to say this is what the issue was. If we're going to have a holistic approach, if we're going to have an overview of what went wrong, we need to leave no stone unturned. And I think it's vital that, well, it would have been vital to have people give evidence as to why they did pass on the contracts that they did, and so that we could identify exactly what went wrong and how things that I personally think shouldn't have made it through did end up finding their way, you know, to contracts being signed.
The other thing that David Williams said was, he said, my personal regret is that whilst I understand the context, there was what was bordering on unacceptable behaviour and pressure was being put on members of the buy team in particular. He said, while some of that was escalated to senior officials working for him, not much of it got to him in that early period. And essentially what should have been happening with the more persistent referrers, and he said referrers, not suppliers, was to say, enough now, you've got to stop. We're going to process the deal, but it's going to be assessed fairly against criteria. We'll come back to you if we need more information. And he again said, I personally regret that I wasn't more in that space. And he said that it was actually only preparing for giving evidence that he became aware of some of the pressures that his team were under. And that's quite a striking admission, because all the way through this module, we've been trying to put to witnesses either about the pressure they themselves were under or the pressure that they were putting other people under. Michael Gove in particular stands out in that regard. And all we got back was that actually we're being naive and unrealistic. Michael Gove even defended that, saying that it was part of his ministerial accountability duties to be going to the team and saying what's happened to this offer. What did you make of his evidence, Enda?
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to that point, speaks to just the lack of a proper and effectively robust system, and probably leadership within that. It's a fair reflection to say now that, yes, in hindsight, I can see that members of my team were put under undue pressure. I've no doubt that that's true. The ideal scenario would be that you had a proper system and proper leadership in place to nip it in the bud at the time, to realize that actually the system is very much open for bad actors, and that with given that flexibility and given the opportunity, they will take advantage of the system. So I think it was a very fair reflection to look back now and to say that actually this is something that should be avoided in future. But in terms of implementing that, we don't have to look much further than, the inquiry's expert report or evidence from the likes of the anti-corruption agency in finding a system that actually works better and protects not only the end users of PPE, but the people who are actually doing the procuring and the people who are being put under pressure. There are what appear to be easy fixes to that going forward.
Thanks, Enda. Moving on now to the oral closing submissions that were made on Thursday. We were first up on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. And one of the things I wanted to draw out was the real world impact of procurement decisions. Anna Morris said this: in the real world, clinicians were faced with difficult choices as to how to treat patients. And as Professor Moonensingh recognised, it is possible that the pressure of a lack of essential life-saving equipment, like ventilators, may have changed the way that clinicians thought about how to escalate some critical care patients, something that many of the families that we represent experienced. And I know that when Anna said that, she had a number of our clients in mind, and a number of them have been in touch with us over the weekend to say thank you for recognising that real world impact, because I think a lot of these politicians seem to think that their procurement decisions happened in some kind of vacuum, and that the real world, I mean, quite often they were saying that the real world, they were in the real world and we didn't understand the pressures they were under. They didn't understand the real world that clinicians were under. And I think that was clear to see. Lobby, was there anything else from our closing submission that particularly struck you?
I just wanted to pick up on that point you made there, Nicola, actually, just because I think it's something that's so vital, is the fact that it seems to be a recurring theme in throughout COVID and in this inquiry, that there seems to be a disconnect between the experience of the politicians and what was happening for everyone else in the country, and the idea that these political choices didn't have consequence. Something that I thought, yeah, as someone who lost a loved one, I think it's hard to express or quantify just how life-changing those decisions are. and people have to carry, you know, the weight of their decisions. People have to carry the loss of their loved ones for the rest of their lives, and why it can be so painful to hear of things of, you know, record profits and people, you know, seeing this as an opportunity rather than a crisis is, I found it really powerful that was mentioned, and I'm always grateful to you guys at BJC for representing us so well, both, you know, technically, but also empathetically. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Lobby. Brenda Campbell KC made the closing submission on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved, and this was an absolutely electrifying closing. One of the most standout lines was when Brenda said this: "It was a process that was more focused on triaging people rather than product, a system that was, giving it perhaps the most generous interpretation, ripe to be hijacked by shysters and fraudsters at huge financial, political and human cost that will be felt for generations to come." Enda, what were the standout bits for you?
Yeah, indeed. Trust Brenda to find the words to encapsulate what we're all thinking about this part of the inquiry. Yeah, I suppose again, given that this module differs from other modules in that we were at sometimes praising the approach taken by the devolved administrations and in Northern Ireland, but only as compared with what we've seen at UK government level. So there wasn't a very high bar. But nonetheless, that was acknowledged in the closing that there were some successes. But to the points of shortcomings, Brenda rather cheekily pointed to the fact that in the afternoon, the Department for Health would likely give themselves a pat on the back and be self-congratulatory in their closing submissions. Now, the context for that is essentially that in every other module, most notably Module 3 and Module 2C, we have heard the department get up in closing submissions and either say they've performed well in the circumstances or acknowledge some shortcomings, but say that they've already been identified and addressed and won't happen again effectively. So there's been a real lack of self-reflection across the board, which is a problem for the inquiry, because if the department already think they have fixed all the problems that need to be fixed, then there isn't room for much more learning. So that was the context of those comments. Ironically, then, what we did see in the afternoon was some pats in the back from the department. They insisted that they weren't being self-congratulatory, but actually they used up most of their closing submissions doing just that. Another point of reference from it was that they had used their closing submissions to correct the record on various parts of previous evidence, which generally isn't allowed. That's the equivalent of giving evidence. But putting that aside, I think it was a powerful but balanced closing from Brenda. And importantly, she also pointed out the key issues that the inquiry haven't looked at in Module 5, because there's been an over focus probably on the VIP lane, but that's due to time restraints and other things. But things that were in the scope of the inquiry that weren't covered included things like the role of technology and AI in future procurement, whether there's sufficient skills and experience and training to deal with a future crisis, what PPE might look like in a future pandemic, how can we diversify sources of supply, how can we guard against forced labor, child labor, human trafficking, and modern safety, and the demands on the environment, considering the climate crisis. So lots of things that were to be investigated really were only touched on very lightly, if at all. So I think it was important that was pointed out at the end of the inquiry as well.
Thanks, Enda. Finally, I just want to touch on the closing submissions made by the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition. Now, this module is the only module they're in, and I have to say they have been absolutely brilliant in this module, really helped distill some of the issues, particularly for those of us for whom procurement is a relatively new area. And he pointed to the evidence from Matt Hancock that when he was asked challenging questions about his decisions, Matt Hancock asserted that we were all naive and you had to be there. And Gavin Heyman, on behalf of the coalition, said, well, we were there. He said his organisation was directly involved in helping other countries with their pandemic procurement. And actually, they had put out guidance as early as March 2020, based on the strategies of 100 experts on how to approach procurement in an emergency. But he concluded that in the UK, who you knew mattered more than what you knew or what suppliers you had. And even by the government's own audits and the inquiry's evidence, you were over 10 times more likely to get a deal if you went through the VIP lane. They've also established that the VIP lane deals had a higher failure rate than deals that came through other sources. And he said this, you can't have it both ways. If you care about PPE and saving lives, you need a professional, structured process that delivers results, not hugely risky contracts with untested suppliers, some of whom didn't even exist until a few days before getting a contract. And I think that just neatly summarises what the common sense approach is as compared with the approach that our government took. And their closing submission, and in fact all of their written submissions to the inquiry, I would urge everyone to have a look at, because where they set out the facts and the figures, it really is quite appalling, the failure rates and the billions that were lost by this country to failed PPE. Lobby, just want to come to you for some closing thoughts.
I think the biggest thing that I took away from Module 5 was just that it is this recognition of, I think throughout the pandemic and throughout this inquiry, we've heard of this idea of balancing saving lives or saving the economy, saving money, and that kind of thing. And Module 5, I think, paints a really clear picture that the government failed in both. So much money was wasted and lost, and as a consequence, at the same time, so many people lost their lives. So I think, you know, for me, that excuse of having to pick one or the others never really made sense. But even if that were true, we can see clearly that there's been a massive failure in both, and that from the evidence we've heard, especially from the devolved nations, some issues and mistakes are unavoidable, but this level of corruption was something that could have been avoided, and feels like it was a choice that the central government made. And, you know, I hope that one of the lessons we take forward is putting in place structures to prevent this opportunity of exploitation by those who happen to be in power, and making sure the next time we find ourselves in such a crisis, we already have procedures, we already have the triaging process, we already have the connections and the stockpiles to prevent this, disaster from happening again.
Thanks, Lobby. Enda, can I come to you for some closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think actually the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition were my overall highlight of Module 5. A real breath of fresh air when you have a group of experts coming together with no ulterior motive, only to say this is how it could be done differently. And you know, our job is to find holes in the evidence and to identify areas where there was issues and criticisms to be made. But we very much lean on organizations like them to provide the expertise and the solutions in future. So I hope that the chair will lean heavily on not only our submissions, but their submissions when compiling a report on Module 5.
Thank you, Enda. Okay, I think that brings us to a close. Thank you, Lobby and Enda, for joining me and for sharing all of your thoughts on Module 5. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.